Wonderful. I would like to get POIs in the chat, please. No need for vocal POIs, just write them in the chat, and I will take you later. Panel, when we idolize the founder of our nation, which in the end of the day is decided that we should be separate and unique and different from those around us, separate from the Hindus, separate from India, this is where extremism happens, this is where isolation happens, and this is where attacking and harming minorities within my country and creating more conflict and wars with other countries is what's happening. What we are going to do in our case is very simple. We're going to explain how idolization of such a founder is the sort of thing that leads to a pipeline where there is more and more extremism and moving more and more towards isolation and more to opposing other groups and other minorities. Then we will discuss how it affects us both inside, where the minorities within Pakistan are harmed, and both outside, where we cause more conflict, harming both our civilians and civilians in India, which we think is overall bad, as this is from an objective perspective debate. Let's talk about idolization. So how does it look? It means that it is taught in school. I'm learning about his life. I'm learning about all the good deeds that he's done. He is celebrated, right? He's celebrated as a liberator. He's idolized. We're basically saying that what he was doing is infallible. His approach, his political approach, is what was the correct way and is tied together to the liberation of our people and tied together to any success that our country has achieved to. We think that what happens is that when there is no idealization, basically everything that person did is far more prone to criticism, and there is far more allowance to basically say that we should have been less Islam-oriented, for example, or less anti-India. And we think both of these aspects are extremely important. Let's talk about why idealization causes extremism. And I will point out that if there was no idealization, there would have been room for other groups to come up, and Guy will analyze what groups exactly those are and how they would have gotten more traction in the political sphere. So how does it happen when there is idealization? So as I said, there are two aspects to this idealization. First of all, the person is just above us, that he is always correct, that his planning was good and did good to India as a whole, and he's infallible. The second aspect is more like martyrdom, right? That we are owed something to this person because he is basically the reason we are here today as the way that we are. We are owed to continue his legacy and not betray that, because that would be like a betrayal of someone that did something amazing to us. So when he is defined as the founder and defined as like the birth of the nation and defined as what caused us to liberate it, the first thing that happens is that we literally cannot oppose his ideas, right? When he's so above and beyond and we are owed that to him, people on the street when they're talking about him, people that are talking about what sort of approach to do, in the media when they are talking about him, they are saying that this is the correct way. And every person that tries to pose something else can immediately be tagged as someone betraying the legacy and betraying the memory and betraying a literal hero of the nation. The second aspect is political figures. Again, in political battle, in the media, when they're trying to convince their voters, every time they can go to this very easy scapegoat of saying, this person does not reflect our true beliefs, he does not reflect represent our idol, and therefore we should not support them. And when the idol is literally the idea of isolation, it means that there is less criticism. So there is less criticism for other approach, but also this approach by itself is celebrated. Second aspect, not only is the original approach celebrated, but it is actually exaggerated, right? So what we are saying is that, as I just pointed out, it's very easy political capital. We appeal to the crowds. We are using this idol to basically say, I am like this good person, so you should like me. But what do I further do? I'm basically saying I'm not just this person. I'm what this person didn't manage to do in their life, right? Because what happens usually when a person is dying? We are basically saying they were wise, they learned from the years. In the end of the days, they reached the true conclusion. And what was the true conclusion of Muhammad? That we should be separate, unique, only support the Muslim, be different from Hindu, be different from India. And in that respect, we're saying, well, he didn't actually manage to fulfill it to the fullest, because the fullest idea is not just to be different, but separate in the same place and allow some room, but rather overly exaggerate the support for Muslim, overly not take care of other minorities, overly be protective of our national identity. And if you are a true believer like myself that tries not only to stop where my leader stopped, but rather to continue his legacy and take it a step further, you should join me. And this is exactly how in the population, this is exactly how it happens, that the politicians become more extreme and the population follows through because of that. We think it happens a lot of time in religion, right? When we are taking all different religious figures and we take their gospel to a further extreme. Yes,
Yeah, Pakistan's been a military dictatorship since 1958. Why are you running arguments about politicians and elections?
So the general idea is that the ability to be able to be so extreme and the ability to maintain dictatorship is a lot stronger when you can actually pull all the voters, not the voters, all of the people against you, not want them to oppose you, when they can basically agree to the dictatorship because they themselves kind of empathize and agree with the idealization of what this dictatorship represents. So of course, even if we're not talking about literal voting, we do talk about the ability to oppose and try to overthrow or change the regime when it is becoming so extreme, and the ability to accept such an extreme a dictatorship. So what we're saying there is that in the end of the day, what the perception in the street, and when people allow for this sort of extremism, allow for more military action against other and more oppression of minorities, is exactly the place where we see, oh, we cannot go with India because Pakistan is unique. Muslim is unique, so we cannot go along with Hindu and other. Pakistan must work exclusively for the Muslim people. And it means that there is no ability to push for anything else. What sort of actions does this cause? It means that in the end, when you can move funds and put more education and more into culture and more into regions that are dominated by the Muslims and push more to things that help specifically to the Muslims. It means that separationist ideas, like to move away from collaboration, to move away from collaborative economy, for example, from India, to go to all of these lengths to basically separate ourselves from India, are pushed far more. It means that antagonism towards India is something that is pumped more in the media and to the people, right? Because what basically are we saying? If there was no real reason, like if we could have been together, right? So we should work together. But why do we need to be so separate and so different? Because India is the enemy. It threatens our very uniqueness by its mere existence and by its mere ideas. So basically, what happens is that when there is so much antagonism, it's not only that my own people are antagonistic, but it also fuels the other side, right? So India, for example, sees my people, see how much hatred or how much they don't want to work alongside with me, and they feel more prone to protect themselves now and be more offensive, or minorities within it are more offensive. How does this happen? It means that inside violence, oppression, all of these things that happen to the Hindu, that happen to the Sikh, that happen to the Ahmadis, the ability to get support, the ability to get funds, the institutionalized racism, all of these are done to a far greater extent. And it means that outside, the willingness to make conflict without my own people saying, oh, wait, this is enough, you are making too many wars, it literally costs our lives, is far easier when I can portray the other side as our enemy and me working in the ways of our true believers. Beg you to propose.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Prime Minister, for a fine speech. I now invite Leader of Op to open up opening ops case.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes.
No figure that is idolized is ever perfect, but in a world where we cannot control who humans put on a pedestal, we rather that human be a unifying, moderate figure like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, as compared to other figures within 20th century Pakistan that would be far more extreme and far more militaristic. Rebuttals will be mainly integrated. I just want to note one point on setup. I think this debate primarily happens after his death because most of the idolization takes place after his death, basically, like because that's his legacy. But we're happy to defend his idolization during his existence as well. First argument, why is Muhammad Ali Jinnah a better figure to idolize in history as compared to any other counterfactual? I want to note two qualities about him. The first is that although he is nominally pro-Muslim and advocated for Muslim recognition as a social group, he was still ultimately a unifying and moderate figure within the group of advocates for the Muslim recognition. That is to say, due to his past association with the Hindu-Muslim unifying group, he was the fact that he was part of unifying moderate groups like the All India Muslim League, for example, he has a remnant of his legacy that he has to stake on that is still fundamentally built on at the very least some level of goodwill and coexistence and unification with the Hindu community. Secondly, he was just a far less militaristic and extremist leader as compared to the military leaders who took control of power after Jinnah's death. This means two things. One, there is far more censure and backlash, and there was far more censure and backlash against people who utilize his legacy to push extremist or pro-Muslim narratives too far or to justify brutal actions against certain minority groups because of that remnant legacy that he had about unification and treating others fairly. But secondly, there is more moderacy among the most powerful or salient political parties and the groups who stake themselves on Ali Jinnah's legacy, because you have to be faithful towards that legacy, because disingenuous portrayals of this legacy will very easily caught out by the population as a whole. After his death, why is it that if it were not him, other figures would have been idolized and these figures would have been worse? The first group of leaders that will probably be idolized are the more militaristic or extremist leaders. And this is for three reasons. The first is that these were the individuals who took on the next most powerful political positions. So, for example, the chief of staff of the Pakistani army. Secondly, these were leaders who were more optically salient. They promoted the harshest policies to cater to their majoritarian tendencies or right-wing bases. And thirdly, more broadly, these were the leaders who were just more willing to play into majoritarian tendencies because they didn't have the level of political acuity or tact as compared to other political figures. Why is this going to be bad? The first thing to note here is that these military leaders, with this idolization, would have been able to get into positions of political power more readily, either through the ballot box or less public censure or criticism when they forcibly take over the government in a military takeover or military coup. These leaders were especially oppressive in the Bangladesh-Pakistani War in 1971. They did things like Pakistani military and militias engaging in acts of murder, genocide, rape against the Bengali group in Bangladesh, for example. These acts would have happened far more readily and with far more impunity and far less backlash in this counterfactual world. I want to note over here that there's also a direct rebuttal on India-Pakistan relations to opening government, because these leaders would have been far more hardline on India-Pakistan relations. So, for example, when you are a political leader, there is probably still some incentive to sate your minority Hindu religious groups within Pakistan, because they will still be ultimately important at some point in the ballot box, or at the very least for preserving some semblance of national unity. As a military leader, because force is your main mechanism to enforce control, there's really very little onus for you to care about the Hindu population, or at the very least, you don't care about it because it's not part of your training as a political leader as a whole. And so ultimately, this is probably going to make relations between India and Pakistan far worse. I also want to note here that this also probably worsens terrorism because of the lack of political avenues or representation that often comes with more hardline military leaders, or more hardline or more idolization of military leaders as a whole, which probably leads to more militaristic regimes emerging in the future. There's probably going to be more oppression and hardship from such a punitive regime, which is what worsens the anger and disenfranchisement that oftentimes spurs religious terrorism in these kinds of contexts as a whole. But next, I want to note here that the other kinds of figures that would probably be idolized are local religious and community leaders, i.e. local people with influence within their respective localities, villages, constituencies, etc. The reason is twofold. The reason is because these are the next closest touch points to the average Pakistani citizens as compared to the leader that they idolize as a whole. And these are individuals that are probably going to be more varied and more extreme in their religions, because there's less incentive or less need to cater to larger communities or larger groups. So there's no pressures to moderate among these individuals. These are individuals that are probably going to be far more extreme. Why is this bad? I think this is bad because it's tremendously bad for national unity. When you have different idolizations of these leaders, you have more political splintering because a lot more parties and candidates band around different political figures with a lot of heft and a lot of legacy and weight behind their name. And so there's probably going to be far more conflict, which makes national unity far harder to preserve, leading to more lives lost, more deaths as a whole. Before I move on to talking about his idolization during his existence, I would like to take a POI from closing, please.
You're right that glorification is a zero-sum game. But glorification of the entities you talk about is extremely independent from the glorification of this character, because he is a founding leader. Who, as a comparative, would have been perceived as a founding leader of Pakistan?
I think it's not exactly mutually exclusive. So, for example, in India, while you have Gandhi, who is the founding leader, there's also people like Nehru who have been idolized, right? So there are many other figures within the pantheon of people who existed in that contemporary space who can very easily take on the role of idolization if Muhammad Ali Jinnah didn't have that legacy or weight behind him. I think these are ultimately the people like your militaristic leaders, your generals, for example. Think about the post-Sukarno in Indonesia, for example, when you have a lot of generals who were idolized, who were part of the G60 movement, for example. example, once Sukarno was deposed from power. This is the most likely counterfactual. During his existence, I think his early idolization was good to keep the country together for a very simple reason, which is that there was one clear, consistent figure to idolize. So at the very least, there was some level of stable governance for at least the next two candidates. The 2 decades. There were no competing political figures or parties that may destabilize the country, which is basically what I mentioned previously as a whole. This is very important for a few reasons. One, just for national stability and less conflict and less ice loss. But secondly, also for economic development. And I think the closest example I can think of is probably like Lee Kuan Yew, for example, who was someone with a huge amount of political baggage as a whole, but was able to project a level of certainty, a level of stability within the country that did things like, one, allow Pakistan to be able to build a burgeoning manufacturing base, but secondly, to create a slightly higher level of economic certainty that was able to attract some level of foreign direct investment, which is why Pakistan's manufacturing base, even to this day, even despite all the political vicissitudes and volatilities it has been through, is still relatively robust and strong. Very quickly then, I think it's also important to recognize that Muslims as a distinct cultural and political group is not a priori, like it's not a bad thing. It is important, it is good that they have this recognition, they have this salience, because in the comparative, it is unclear or uncertain as to whether they'll get that same level of legal and political rights. We think that they should be recognized as a distinct cultural and political group for very, very principled reasons, but also for practical reasons as well. For those reasons, oppose.
Great. Thanks so much, Leader of Op, for that fine speech. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to extend for opening government.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. I am going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, and I would first of all like to engage in characterization and what the alternative is likely to look like. First of all, in terms of, oh no, he was such a unifying figure and not extreme at all, I disagree. I think his idolization is portrayed in a very extremist manner for 3 reasons. Number one, I just disagree with the moderate figure. I think that the Infoslide tells us that he wanted a strong Islamic identity and based the majority of his later ideology on, and also that he distrusted specifically Hindu identity and colonial forces. That is to say, he probably viewed Hindu identity and other minorities as relatively bad, at least in his later life. He likely distrusted colonial ideas like democracy is a sham, the Western powers are trying to use like a white man burden to push on us. I don't think he was moderate. Second of all, even if he was moderate at some point, I think that the heel turn itself creates a large opportunity to portray him as only becoming less and less moderate over time. That is to say, even if he was moderate at some point, he realized the error of his mistakes and only became more extreme, which shows that Islam is correct and Islamization is correct. Number 3, I want to use the dictatorship. The dictatorship, as opening opposition said, ruled Pakistan for a very long time, obviously had a strong interest to shape the idolization and control. They controlled the education system, they controlled public media. Since they came into control of Pakistan at a relatively early stage of history, the dictatorship also likely had a large amount of control in how the idolization was created in the first place. This means that they were going to create the idolization in the most extreme and specifically pro-dictatorship manner possible. That is to say, at the point in which you have a national figure who has died and people have represented, the dictatorship has an interest to portray the national figure as in coherence with the dictatorship and therefore supporting a strong authoritarian government, strong authoritarian measures, etc. Note, we agree that the likely comparative would have been dictatorships. I'll explain for a second why they were being secular, but just to deal with the comparative of local leaders, I think that local leaders' idolization is not mutually exclusive, right? Because you can both idolize the person who founded the country and the person who is your local leader. This is not mutually exclusive. I agree that the likely comparative would have been local dictators who would have been seen as founders alternatively. B, obviously the dictatorship doesn't have much interest for people to idolize their local leaders over the dictatorship, so it's likely that local leader idolization was clamped down by the dictatorship and they didn't control. Then, why had the dictatorship had the capability to idolize itself and not a founding leader? They would have idolized him in a non-Islamic way. Number one, they would have done that in order to get away from previous Islamic parties that have ruled Pakistan. Note that if there was already a strong the level of idolization of this founding leader, and Pakistan was already seen as an Islamic state following him, then it was in the interest of the dictatorship to follow him and copy him in Islam and use his idolization for the purpose of the dictatorship. However, had he not existed, the dictatorship would have had the capacity to idolize its own leaders, and the dictatorship would have wanted to idolize them in a way which would have been contra to Pakistan before. They created the country, but we founded it. We made it into control and made it into what it actually is. Second of all, because America influenced Pakistan for a very large time as a key strategic ally in the region. That is to say, India for a long time was a socialist country with an explicitly linked to Korea. The United States explicitly influenced Pakistan as an ally against countries in the region, which meant that America had a large amount of influence, and America specifically would have wanted to influence Pakistan in a secular direction had the idolization not happened, had everything that Nadav describes to you not occurred. Number three, because more critical scholarship and moderate scholarship would have likely existed. That is to say, at the point at which you're not idolized, you're not taught one specific narrative that the dictatorship has crafted from age zero about what this founding leader has looked like. And Nadav already explains to why this idolization is so strong and how oppressive and coercive it is. Then it would have likely been far more easy to create alternative viewpoints, right? That what matters really is earlier than scholarship, or is not as extreme as you were liking it to be, and would have been far more easier to paint a counter vision of a person who was far more moderate. Why is this so important? Let's first of all talk to you about, just for the bottom line of this, I really don't think that like Pakistan would have become like more democratic or less dictatorial or authoritarian or whatever. I think the dictatorship had the number one interest to make the national identity of Pakistan as dictatorship and as authoritarian as possible. And therefore, really the only delta in the debate is on whether or not we're getting an Islamic dictatorship or a more secular dictatorship. Why then is a secular dictatorship better? First of all, minorities. We're talking about Hindu people, we're talking about Sikh people, we're talking about the Ahmadis people who are like came from Islam but are seen as heretical by Islam. There are a lot of ethnic minorities in Pakistan and religious minorities. To be clear, this idolization affects both the public that the dictatorship does defend on in consent to some extent, because there were like counter coups during the dictatorship and dictatorship switch, and the dictatorship does want public consent, but also obviously the dictators after time, because everything that Nadav explained about going up on the dictator likely affects the dictator itself and how they perceive everyone. Then note that if I agree in this is very Islamic radical narrative, that this is how Pakistan looks like, I am interpreting everything that minorities do as worse. That is to say, minorities are a lot of people, even if they're one unified group. And if I already think that minorities are evil, conniving, and are planning to destroy Pakistan, because that's how the founder has been idolized and everything there, I am far more likely to interpret small amounts of minorities making fringe comments about how Pakistan is bad as representing the entire minority, and therefore I see minorities as worse and different. Number two, this radicalizes minorities themselves. When minorities live in a state that is literally built upon anti-minority stances, minorities themselves become more radical or more prone to radical actions, such as terror or radical protest, which by itself creates more backlash and oppression from the narrative. Number three, I see the consequences of policies against minorities differently. That is to say, I see when I oppress minorities and minorities backlash, the backlash as natural, as something expected, not something caused by the policy. Comparatively, when I am more secular, none of this occurs. I'm far more willing to look at it in a more rational sense. Minorities are not any different than the majority Pakistani Muslims, and therefore I'm willing to make the same policies as the Pakistani Muslims. Note, this is terrible because the dictatorship has a huge timescale and extent of impact on minorities, right? Literally just constant oppression in every single area of their life occurring constantly. Compared to say like IR or something, I think that in India-Pakistan wars happen far less, and India has far more way to defend itself. Minorities are constantly oppressed by the large power of the state, have no recourse. Comparatively, the average population of Pakistan still has like a level of recourse to go out to protest. The dictatorship cares about the average Pakistani citizen at the point at which they draw support from them. Robert Raos, I'll take your point.
How do you think Ali Jinnah is taken in India?
I do not care. I think that India is a strong state by itself and can live for itself. I think that even if India hates Pakistan, A, there is external mediation. B, I think both states has nukes which are deterrents to do so. So our oppression happens more, occurs way more constantly, and will pay why further. Lastly, about Bangladesh. Just to be clear, Bangladesh was a lost cause, right? Bangladesh was far away from Pakistan. There was literally all of Bangladesh wanted independence. Nobody internationally supported the Bengali genocide while it was happening. The only reason why the Pakistani government continued to fight was because of this legacy. Was because Ali Jinnah said, you have to be united. You have to be literally all of the Muslims together, or you're going to fall. It was because Ali Jinnah specifically wrote treatises on how much Bangladesh and Pakistan are together and are supposed to be united. And all of this idolization of Nadav explains to you why it's done coercively, why it's done irrationally, why many people buy into this narrative in a very irrational sense. I think when this idolization does not occur and happens in a more secular capacity, Pakistan realizes far earlier that it's a lost cause, that it's losing troops, that it doesn't support, that it's going to lose the war, and therefore the genocide lasts for far less time and far less capacity. Note, opening government prevents genocide, prevents death, prevents a large amount of people that were directly killed by the Pakistani forces. Again, this is far larger than the people who have ever died from Pakistan-Indian clashes were far less in intensity. So this wins by itself.
Great, thanks so much to the Deputy Prime Minister for the fine speech. And now invite then the DLO to wrap up the opening half.
Ready to go? Is my audio all right?
Yeah.
Beautiful. All right, do POs have you like in the chat or on mute or whatever suits you. The fundamental lie of opening government is that things are very bad and they cannot get worse. And that manifests in two ways, both of which are untrue. The first way it manifests is in their entirely unproven assertion that the form of Islam embraced by the Pakistani government has been a very radical and a very extremist one. And the observation I make is that this seems to confuse the forms of Islam that manifested with the development of Wahhabism, the development of the Iranian Revolution, with the form of Islam that existed as the result of people like Jinnah, as a result of people that were moderate and secular and democratic leaders who presided over a state that was independent based on religion, but was also multi-ethnic and multi-religious, that did not tie ethnicity and religion together, that engaged in democratic elections. All of those things are part of a vision of Islam as a secular one. That vision is one that was better under this side. It is not proven by this team that it was a bad one. But the second lie they say is they say, well, Pakistan was already as dictatorial as it could be. And the illustration I make here is that there is a subtle mistake they make, which is that our case is not one that the dictatorship would have been legitimized under their side, but that the military would have been legitimized. That in the absence of a founding father being found in the political sphere, you find a founding father in the military sphere, in the people that fought against India in the wars of independence and after independence, in the people that fought rearguard actions against Hindu militias during partition, in the people that have been traumatized by war and motivated to create a narrative that was extremely anti-India, that was extremely anti-Hindu, that was extremely nationalist and extremely violent. Those leaders had their ideology and their status been the ones that were preeminent during the times of, for example, the War of Bangladeshi independence, would have been far more genocidal, far less willing to listen to Western governments, far less willing to listen to their backers. They would have done far worse. So I'm going to deal with two things in this speech. First, I'm going to be very charitable to this government bench and assume that no one else would have been idolized in the comparative, and I'll explain why that's undesirable. Then I'll explain why someone worse would have been idolized in the comparative and win on that ground as well. Opening government make three claims about why it is bad that this person was idolized. First claim they make is they say, well, it's generally undesirable for someone to be idolized because it makes policy stagnant. The country resolves around what they do. First thing I note is this is enormously common in most countries, right? Like most countries have a founding father like Lee Kuan Yew or George Bush or George Washington or Kwame Nkrumah or people like Patrice Lumumba. Those people are very common. Those countries are not ones that are stagnant. And the reason that is twofold. Firstly, usually the legacy of these people is pretty contested and what they stood for is multifaceted. For instance, you could do what opening government does and ignore all the bits of the info slide that talk about Jinnah being a moderate person who had initially tried to cooperate with India, who had all of these other attributes and focus on one thing, or you could focus on those, right? So you can contest their legacy. It doesn't stagnate policy. But thirdly, over time, the policy prescriptions this person supports become less relevant, which is why someone like Juan Perón doesn't actually motivate policy in Argentina these days, because the prescriptions Perón did in the 80s are just completely disanalogous to today. The second claim they make is they say, well, he reinforced the dictatorship. So his idolization supported the dictatorship. There are two problems with this. Firstly, he was fundamentally a democratic leader. And they say, well, you can change him and talk about the authoritarian stuff he did. But it is impossible for a dictatorship, especially the Pakistani one, which is relatively inefficient, has very little control over the left methods of teaching because Muslim schools and madrasas are pretty influential, has very little the capacity to do things like control education, control narratives, control TV, because that requires a lot of money, a lot of wealth, a very developed repressive system, which they do not have, and which this team does not prove that they have. Even if they could control all of that, they can't erase people's memories that this was a democratic leader who they voted for in democratic elections, who led the country as a democratic governor general. But secondly, even if you believe their best case scenario and they think he did reinforce the dictatorship, it's not clear why that's a win. Under their side, maybe more people resist the dictatorship. They never prove why that's a good thing. Those people will be gunned down in the streets. They have nowhere near enough capacity to overthrow it. The dictatorship had built up far more weapons in a way that would never have been stopped. Their final claim is that he was radically anti-Hindu and anti-India. There are three problems with this. Firstly, there was no reason given to believe that he was radically anti-Hindu and anti-India. They lie about what the info slide says. They say the info slide says he was strongly Islamic. That is a lie. Those words are not in the info slide. They say the info slide says he was very anti-Hindu. That is a lie. Those words are not in the info slide. They say that he was anti-Western. That is also a lie. It's not in the info slide. The thing the info slide says is that you saw Muslims a distinct cultural identity. Fine. That's a moderate position. Plenty of countries recognize Muslims as an independent religious entity. Indonesia recognizes an independent religious entity. Lots of European countries do. That does not necessarily make him extremist. And there's no proof given as to why he was. There's in fact substantial proof to believe that he was not extremist. Firstly, the info slide describes him trying to cooperate with India. Secondly, that his method of governance meant that he must be cooperative. So unlike military leaders who just fought India, he also had to work with India, do things like certify partition, do things like cooperate into the future as a governing leader. Thirdly, the fact he was educated in Western context, the fact that he grew up living most of his life in England, where he was moderated, exposed to moderate views. Finally, even if he was very pro-Muslim, Rich explains that's a good thing, because the vision of a moderate and secular and democratic Muslim leader is incredibly important. It legitimizes their status as an oppressed minority. It legitimizes them. It makes them seem more moderate. That is enormously influential, preventing things like pogroms of Muslims in other countries. Finally, even if you believe all of that, we explain idolization was necessary because it made the state work for two reasons. Firstly, the ideas he supported were more moderate than the general opinion of the state. The reasons that they describe about why the dictatorship can coerce people in the state into believing bad things explain why, under their side, most people in the state would have believed those bad things. We explained that he is uniquely resilient to those things. He was uniquely a different leader, so it was important to have him idealized, not them. But secondly, he unified the country. He was, as opposed to local leaders, someone that was national, that everyone could look up to. And it was not a given thing that Pakistan would be a united country. Most people had more loyalties to their pre-existing princely leaders. Most people had more loyalties to the local areas and regions they existed in. They say they have loyalty to the military. The military was itself divided into regional areas. If he was not the national unifying leader, he would have presided over a Pakistan that had devolved into many different states. Closing.
For many of the same reasons you described, the comparative would have been Pakistan's first prime minister, who was Ali Khan. We think that he is better because he's actually elected. You actually lied that Jinnah was elected.
No, so firstly, he was elected. There was democratic support both in literal electoral policy, but also in the fact that there was democratic support for his movement in the contestations leading up to independence, which is when electoral votes were taken. But secondly, it would not have been Ali Khan, because a founding father must secure the independence of the nation, as you can see in your POI. Ali Khan did not do so. On the political front, the person who secured the independence of this nation was Jinnah. On a military front, the person who secured the independence of the nation were the military leaders. And we think those are very bad. Firstly, because as Rick and I explained, those military leaders, were they idolized, would have had all of their atrocities idolized as well, would have been very radical. Final claim for opening up government is, well, at least he was secular. First, at least the military would have been secular in comparison. First thing I note is there are reasons as to why the military is secular would be shoddy. They explain, well, historically, the military didn't cooperate, but the raison d'etre of the state is that it was Muslim. That is why the military was also Muslim from the beginning. They say the US pressures it to be secular. In fact, the US was fine with Islamic groups. It supported people like Mujahideen for a long period after. This is an argument about post 9/11, not pre 9/11 contexts. But even if they were very secular, if that is a bad thing, because it means that the Islamic form of legitimate and moderate Islam that is promoted would never have succeeded. It would have been outcompeted by terrorists. That is a far worse impact. Very, very proud to oppose.
Great. Thanks so much, Diallo, for that fine speech. Thanks, everyone, for the opening half, for a very engaging debate this far. Now inviting member of government to introduce the closing half.
Okay, one sec. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. So let's talk about two things. The first being what the realistic counterfactual is. And notice that OG's counterfactual is woefully inadequate, where they sort of allude to two things. The first being a mysterious, diverse viewpoints. No idea what these diverse viewpoints would have been and why they were likely to arise instead. Secondly, in DPM, they say, well, maybe the US would have pushed for more secular influence. This is said in one line. It's missing critical burdens, like why the US has these incentives, why it's likely to be successful in the first place and received well amongst Pakistan. Woefully inadequate. Who is the counterfactual? As we point out through POIs, it's probably going to be Ali Khan that ruled after Jinnah. Why? This is A, because he is very public. He was the first prime minister and acted on had to speak publicly to the public on many occasions. He had to do things like campaign. He was broadly popular, which is related to how he became a prime minister in the first place. Secondly, this would have been likely because of his association with Jinnah, because there was a period of overlap where the two ruled concurrently, with Jinnah as the governor general and Ali Khan as the prime minister, which suggests to some extent there is a degree of crossover or bleed over where the association positively with Jinnah also translates to some extent towards Ali Khan that ruled alongside him. But secondly, the fact that they had to work concurrently for at least a small period of time suggests that it is likely that Jinnah actively gave his endorsement of Ali Khan as well, which lends its popularity in that direction. The reason it's probably not the military is twofold. The first being the military is often not a very public figure, where the military does not constantly do things like, for example, go on public talk shows or speak to the public on a constant basis, and it has much less capacity to garner cult of personality in that capacity. At least not any particular member of the military, even if people broadly support the military as a whole. But secondly, these are just like two concurrent things. Like people can have like a favorite politician, like a favorite singer, a favorite sports player. Similarly, you can glorify the military and also glorify like a politician you perceive as like running the country and making broadly political decisions. Why is this a far better counterfactual? I would suggest that the glorification, or even if not the glorification, the comparative weighting of support and attention to Ali Khan, when you do not overfixate on Jinnah, is better because Ali Khan was far more technocratic and moderate, which would have instilled greater narratives and norms surrounding the prioritization of state building. Why? Because this is because A, we just know empirically a couple of facts. It's the fact that, for example, Ali Khan provided some protections for like domestic, ethnic, religious minorities, which suggests to some extent he had more incentives to be more reconciliatory and be more pragmatic domestically. But secondly, we also empirically know that he was assassinated by an extremist, probably for not being extreme enough, because of which creates dissatisfaction, suggesting to some extent that he was comparatively more moderate. But let's prove this structurally as well. I would suggest that the leader, after the initial person that founded Pakistan, would have to be more pragmatic and focus more on state building. This is because of things like, for example, people just like start demanding infrastructure after the initial buzz of gaining independence and the pride around this wears off. You start thinking more about your day-to-day needs, like for example, paying the bill and like where your taxes are going. But secondly, people also just get far more tired of having to be embroiled in constant conflict, which means you have a greater demand for things like domestic stability because people get like war fatigue. People get tired of like riots on the streets from like domestic insecurity or clashes on the border, which suggests that you have to do things like, for example, cater domestically to different ethnic groups to try to stabilize the country. But thirdly, after a period of time, it's far harder for local politicians and leaders to just campaign on identity, because identity becomes far less of a comparative advantage when you all are now like within the same country. So you can't say, I will represent you as a Muslim, because you're predominantly, mostly all Muslims, which suggests that you have to diversify along different lines, like for example, economic policy or other forms of policies as well. This suggests in order to, for example, build domestic coalitions, Ali Khan would have had to moderate after Jinnah that had unilateral support from just by virtue of being the founder. All of these things suggest it's far more likely that this would have been a glorification of things, of policies or a person that was far more pragmatic and pushed domestic technocratic policies, as opposed to things like, for example, the narrative of being separate from Pakistan. But the impact of this is critical. I think glorifications of state building would have just firstly made the domestic lives of people in Pakistan far better if you have like more, for example, focus on building of infrastructure, but also would have shifted the politics away from things like defense and security, which, by the way, is what emboldened the military in the first place. Where the reason the military had so much money, so much power, so much political clout to do things like that, to launch its future dictatorial, like democratic backsliding, dictatorial overthrow, whatever you want to call it, is because they had so much resources given because of Jinnah's hyper focus on things like foreign policy. I want to now talk about why I want to better analyze compared to OG, why specifically Jinnah led to a feeling of distrust and aggression as opposed to just being isolationist, which OG points out is a reasonable interpretation. But before that, I'll take OO.
Yeah, Ali Khan, in your words, is basically indistinguishable from Jinnah, from the same party, same background, same education, and is Jinnah's successor. In a world where Jinnah was not idolized, how can Ali Khan be idolized?
Because they functionally did separate things, but you support them for different reasons. You support Jinnah, for example, foreign policy, which is what he is primarily known for, but Ali Khan, who did not do these things, but had his support and would be recognized for the things he did do, which we proved are good. Why exactly is it the case that Jinnah is necessarily intrinsically tied with aggression as opposed to simply being isolationist? So firstly, I think you would have had a spinning narrative of betrayal, which makes that it is impossible to cooperate with India. Where this is different from OG's mechanism, where they kind of just say, maybe he just like realized the error of his ways and he's eventually correct. I think the better reason is that the way you justify his deviation from the INC is to say the INC was impossible to work with, they betrayed our interests, they refused to listen to us, which suggests that cooperation is fundamentally impossible, and that is why I had to leave the INC and why it was a mistake or an error in the first place, which reinforces the norm that it is impossible to do things like cooperate. But secondly, his foreign policy was just extremely aggressive, where he reacted to Indians' invasion of Jammu and Kashmir by also putting boots on the ground as well, even though he was given the option not to, because the domestic population was very war fatigued. They were tired of violence and conflict. When the British or the US, one of the two, even advised Pakistan to do things like not escalate conflict, he still chose to do so. But secondly, he rejected negotiations negotiations as well over Jammu and Kashmir, where India eventually said, like, let's like negotiate how we want to divvy up the region. They responded initially by attacking India instead, which suggests his foreign policy was incredibly aggressive. This is the legacy that Jinnah left, and this is inherently what he was enshrined for and glorified for, which suggests that it is not simply the case that you can, for example, say his policy stance is just, we should just be alone and isolationist, and Muslims should exist as an independent identity. It's not simply that, but also the fact that you have to respond to foreign security threats with aggression, which we uniquely prove. I want to also do some weighing against opening opposition. OO says dictatorships, counterfactual is very bad. Maybe this is the case, but the margin is very small because we know retroactively that the dictatorship already happened, and it happened, by the way, I believe, after both of these leaders. So the margin of potential change of delaying the dictatorship is very, very small. But the difference then is that we offer the chance that we would have had less dictatorial backsliding from the military because we would have enshrined more domestic security measures, for example, civil services or checks or to enshrine democracy as opposed to things like reinforcing security and reinforcing the military. Even if it's like a 50-50 of which person do we actually glorify, it is better we take this chance because the expected returns are far higher because the margin on their side of the house is so unbelievably small.
3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about 3 questions. The first and most important one, which will underpin the later 2, is what is the comparative and what is trading off in terms of the comparative. The second thing I'm going to talk about is domestic politics and the effect on the formation of the state. And the third, the relationship with India and Hindus, and show how our winning of the characterization clash wins those 2 questions. I want to start with asking what is the comparative. I'll start with the attacks we get on the comparative of Ali Khan. So the first thing that we get told from opening government is, yes, this is like cheese trade. You give one cheese, you take one cheese. There are only 2 comparatives in the world for portraying leaders. So unfortunately, Guy, we are able to nuance this relative to your explanation or concession that it would have been the military glorified otherwise by saying that we think it's true that oppositions and OG are right, that to some extent there would be other military leaders presented as strong. CO is probably right that on the margins, there is to some extent more glorification of military leaders now when you're splitting up the fight and the statesmen. We just think that the extent to which that extra glorification happens as a form of weighing is far less important than the trade-off with who is perceived as the founding father of the nation. You can think about it mathematically. If 10% of the change would have been to imagine another military leader, we're going to explain why 90% would have been to imagine Ali Khan instead. Moving on then to the question of whether Ali Khan is indeed the alternative. We get 2 attacks to this, which funnily enough are contradictory in a way which resolves both of them. The first attack we get in a POI is there's no, he wasn't an independence leader, so he wouldn't have been glorified just the same way. And then Jack says also in a POI that, sorry, he said that in his speech, but also in a POI to Liz says they're the same party, so you can't demarcate or separate what the difference between them is. So the answer to both of these POIs is that there's a middle ground. First of all, he can be portrayed as a leader of the nation, but not a military leader of the nation. Opposition never explained why in a country where the military is so deeply unpopular because of the dictatorship for the majority of the past, like the last 70 years, why in this country the only formation or conception of the state can be the one who fought for us? Why can't it be the first time we had workplaces? Why can't it be the expansion of Karachi into a voting metropolitan? Why can't it be setting up the borders that defend us, even if not during the active invasion? All of these are plausible narratives for part of the state's building and of the independence. But it also explains why it's contrasted with the form of leadership that they talk about, that Jinnah would have had. The form of leadership that says independence is rooted in the fight. It's rooted in the separation. It's rooted in the decision to leave India, because those are 2 different kinds of leadership. It doesn't mean you contradict each other, Jack. That's true. But the question is who you platform as the top national leader. And why is it that you need one? Why can't you have both kinds of statesmanship? Both of them did different niches. The reason is that even if it gets mentioned sometimes, it's like the difference, even if it gets mentioned sometimes, it's like the difference between FDR and Washington. We think that you need a personalized personification story of who is the father of your nation. because through walking through the path of that person's life, you create a personal connection with leadership. You know the details of their life. And curricula will many times dedicate you to know the specifics of that person, even if they mention the other by name. So there is a trade-off to who we make the father of the nation. Who do we want people whose story and detail to remember deeply, and not just the most educated classes outside of school. In that way, we prove Ali Khan is a reasonable comparative. Now let's ask the question, does the perception of the military change significantly as a comparative? Why is it that I think the extent to which you trade off with a military leader is extremely marginal? The reason for this is because even though the military is considered a part of independence, the military, unlike what Jack says, isn't considered the founding part of independence. And this is because the formation of the current Pakistani military, an actor which is very political, which affects prime ministers like Khan and Sharif, an actor which is much more powerful than it was in the past, is completely alien to the sort of military that existed before, where it was much weaker, where it wasn't the one that was separating or building the state. So it is uncredible, but also disassociated from the current military to glorify that part of their history. Rather, the military wants to present those founding fathers as the political entity that legitimized their presence. And the reason this is the foremost incentive for the military is because dissent in Pakistan, which OO analyzes for me why it's likely and why people hate the military regime, means that the military regime wants to constantly portray a narrative that they're aligned with politics, that they're the successors, they're the acting arm of the leaders, and they are not the ones. Also, I don't have a timer, so someone could post timestamps, that would be nice. They're the ones who they're the ones who contributed to this effort in order to make sure that we have a narrative that the founding father, as a political actor, as an elected official of the people, did entrust it into the military. This is the reason why it is more popular to present the military in a distinct way and present the comparative to Jinnah as Ali Khan primarily, even for the military. On the comparative, why is it that what both CO say and OO say about military glorification in bad ways is symmetric? Because the explanation that I gave for why the military currently has people who live the same lifestyles as those soldiers, people who are not statesmen but commanders on the field, means that there is a very easy way to portray those ground-root soldier and glorify their day-to-day lives, which aligns much more with the day-to-day life and routine of a soldier in the Pakistani army, which means they can anyway identify with it more. So if you're appealing to the militant faction, you anyway want to present the most radical ones. Yes, bottom half. Top half.
Even if it is possible for Ali Khan to be idolized while Jinnah is not, Ali Khan was the one who fought the first Pakistani-Indian War, which occurred in 1948, whereas Jinnah cooperated with India during
question. So let's now talk about why it is that this
means thousands more lives.
Stop. Why does this flip the two other clashes? On the question of what happens in India, I just want to weigh. Look, this gives you many reasons for why moderation is a political interest. It's something that's more likely as opposed to OO's assertion. But say you don't believe that. The thing I want to weigh here is what the majority of the public that goes to jobs, the majority of the public that strikes remembers most about the leader's story. They don't remember the details of their policies. This is something that's forgotten. They remember the grief they felt when they heard that the founding father of their nation died. They remember this incident, and this incident is one that uniquely pushes people towards de-radicalization as opposed to their death of Jinnah. Why? Because he died at the hand of a jihadist. He died at the hand of an Afghani terrorist, which means that we know that it could go too far. And this is the parting impression when thinking about these two personalities, even if the questions of policy is a wash. But the second thing we tell you is that if you're not sure who had a more hospitable attitude towards India and Hindus, at least Ali Khan had to collaborate with them. He wasn't betrayed by India and separated into them. He signed peace deals. So at least he's more trusted as a diplomatic actor. Closing government.
All right, great. Thank you so much to Galvit for that fine speech. And I'll invite the OPUP to wrap up the debate.
My Wi-Fi is a bit laggy, so I'll keep my camera turned off. And BOIs in the chat, please. The thing I want to do with my speech is pretty simple. I'm going to explain to you why military is likely to have some extent of power on both sides of the house, but why idolization of Ali Jinnah is a unique narrative, a unique type of ideology within Pakistani politics, which helps moderate most parts of Pakistani citizens, and why this is good in the long term. So firstly, I want to deal with the idea of Ali Khan and what is the comparative here coming from closing government. So it is likely that Ali Khan wouldn't have been idolized on both sides of the house. Why? Because when you look at systems which appeared after colonialism, this is like Nasser's system in Egypt, this is like Bourguiba in Tunis, etc. Those are systems that we'll call the system of a charismatic leader. This means that oftentimes it is not what your teaching is or what your belief is, because there's presumably a lot of people that share your teaching and your beliefs. It is your ability to stand out in the crowd and to be the ones that people perceive had led the revolution, people perceive had led the ideology of separation, being the ones that people perceive had led their unity and their independence, which means that it is not only on closing government to explain why he was a moderate that would do good deeds, it is on them to explain why, insofar he wasn't a public presence and he was not able to beat Ali Jinnah in the eyes of public, he would have done so insofar people haven't idolized Ali Jinnah. The reasons why this probably wouldn't have been so is firstly, is the idea that he necessarily wasn't seen as a huge military leader or as a warrior that tried to sacrifice his life for Pakistan. And even if closing government wants to say that like he was not militaristic, we do believe that insofar you want to do a cult of personality or like identity around yourself, people do have to believe that you're willing to sacrifice your life for their country. So we believe the perception of Ali Jinnah is like what of him leading and sacrificing his life is what allowed him to have this position within society. Secondly, he was not as active and in the main role during the majority of these struggles, meaning that he's oftentimes more easier to ignore and more easier to beat by other opponents within Pakistani society, as opposed to Ali Jinnah, who was like seen as the founding father. Thirdly, he was probably not the one holding the main speeches. He was probably not the one having charisma. This was everything Ali Jinnah was. The reason why Ali Jinnah was like idolized in today's society, even if Ali Khan existed, is not because Ali Jinnah appeared there magically. It is because of all the people who had his ideology and shared it. He was the most charismatic one who was able to communicate to the people. Now, why is this important? Because I want to prove to you that military would like have some extent of power on both sides of the house, but it was necessarily Ali Jinnah's perception of him in the public which allowed him to push for more moderate narratives. So why would military have some form of strength on both sides of the house, and why is the policy that would have been passed by Ali Khan vastly symmetric? Firstly, it is time after war. Closing government wants you to believe that people are tired from fighting and they want a huge economic boost, and this is why Ali Khan would have like backed technocratic policies. We believe that firstly, people are still fighting against the war. You see how dangerous your neighbors are. You see that there are still tensions existing. You just fought a huge war. There's a Cold War brewing and people are militarizing against you. World War II just ended. You have this idea that the world is in a stage of conflict. Your neighbors are a threat to you and there is a huge amount of tension within the state. I mean, there is still a need for the military to step up. Secondly, the military is still quite powerful. You just fought in the World War II. You just fought for your independence, meaning that even though you don't have a huge publicity within the state, you still have some amount of power because you have military weapons within the state, which means that oftentimes there will still have been a need for military to have some power within the state. But the question then is how do you balance their power and what is the countering narrative to the power coming from the military and other forms of leaders? So how does our case step in and how do we beat these claims? We prove you that there is no other narrative that can be co-opted to promote like moderate stances and some form of unity or cooperation with India. Firstly, because religious leaders base the majority of their ideas on religious differences and jihad, which is quite literally violent war against the disbelievers, which means that insofar you opt into them and you believe in their narrative more, you're more likely to be violent. Military generals also use religion and are not secular. Why? Because if you want people to die in the war for you and to join the military, you're likely to tell them, oh, hey guys, if you die, you're going to heaven because you're also fighting jihad on our side against the Hindus, which means that the case coming from opening government, how military leaders are much more secular, is likely not to be true. And note like intuition pump, Iran used this when fighting Iraq. They literally told like young kids who were like in their military, they're going to get keys to the heaven insofar they fight on their side to like beat the infidels, meaning that it is likely that other alternatives would have been much, much worse off and would also not be secular or tolerant towards the rest of the society and have more incentives as to why they would be militaristic, because religious leaders believe in jihad, which is a war, but also like military is militaristic, which means that anything that is not that is inherently less militaristic and violent than those two alternatives. So how does this then narrative propagate, and why do we get more moderate policies on our side of the house? Always correct to say that you now have a moderate government and you have someone more moderate in power. But what then happens is, insofar you have a strong idealization and you have a strong narrative, this manifests in a couple of ways. This moderate government has an incentive to push more moderate teaching to kids in school, meaning that the kids themselves, when they learn about independence, are more likely to opt into this. Why? Firstly, they believe that what you're teaching them is factually correct because everything else you teach them is factually correct, like science. Secondly, there is a reward system for producing this knowledge about the independence and how independence should look like. Thirdly, you expose them to these ideas systematically throughout years. And fourthly, you instill into them that this is what independence is all about. Even if you have a strong military power, you have a moderate government in Pakistan which is able to do this. Before I go into impacting this, I'll take opening.
Muslim League wasn't the main anti-British fighter and coalition builder, that was the National Congress. Having an idol with a mixed legacy that actively renounced moderation at some point is worse than having a wholly secular idol to draw the same narratives from.
No, what we told you is that a huge part of his teaching was being moderate, which means that it is easy for people, insofar he's idolized, to co-opt that part of his narrative. Other narratives like that don't exist because other narratives you have in Pakistani society right now are either the military or religious leaders in like their religious schools, etc. So why is this then important that the moderate government currently is pushing this part of his legacy? Because for the kids that are learning this, it is harder to radicalize them against the Indians, and it's harder to get them into radicalized terrorist groups within Pakistan because they now don't believe the narrative that fight for independence and fight for their life is necessarily the fight against Hindus. Rather, they believe that they have a separate identity, which doesn't necessarily manifest itself as hateful, rather as these are the things that makes us special, not necessarily we hate Hindus, which is something the military and religious leaders both promote. Why is this good? Firstly, you have less instability within the region. Why? Because the Pakistani government doesn't want war for all the reasons that Robbie gave you. All the peace deals between Pakistan and India were literally breached by terrorist attacks from the Pakistani terrorist group, not the Pakistani military. Insofar you have less people radicalized into these groups, you have less instability. But secondly, and this is the easiest burden to prove, less terrorist groups means less terrorization of people within Pakistan, ethnic minorities within Pakistan, which is quite a nice impact to have because it is hard to solve instability, but it's much easier to make sure have less people terrorizing and killing people on ground. For these reasons, CEO.
All right, great. Thanks so much. Up with a fine speech. Thank you everyone for a very fun final. For the panel, let's move the